You're listening to Open Conversations on Learning Matters, a podcast discussing the challenges our children face in today's educational system and the future of education in the digital age.
Hello, I'm Brian Hack, one of your co-hosts, and we welcome you to Open Conversations about Learning Matters, a bi-weekly series of conversations about our K-12 systems and all matters related thereto. And please let me introduce our two books. This is our first one here. Get that up. There we are. Listening to Our Students and Transcending K-12 to Save Our Nation. And it presents an entirely new and unique model of K-12 education. Our second book, let me hold that up. Same cover, little different title. A companion guidebook for local communities to establish Dalles Centers for Lifelong Learning. And this book provides a step-by-step how-to explanation of the process to set up a Dalles Center. And it has all the tools and resources local communities would need. Both books are available at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, Exlibris.com, and this is now currently our third podcast program, our third episode on the subject of digital age skill sets.
Hi there, I'm Alec Ostrom, your other co-host for this third episode, and today we're going to focus on what we call the digital age skill sets. And as we mentioned in the first two episodes, we have developed a new model for K-12 education that we call our Digital Age Learning Systems, or DALS model. This new model is designed to transcend our present K-12 school systems, and it has several new and unique components. One of those components are the digital age skill sets, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we dive into this conversation, however, let me emphasize that we really need to understand, we've discussed and will continue to discuss the main components of our model, the Dalles model of K-12 education. But it's very important for everyone in our audiences to understand that all of these components are interconnected. They all work together in our new model. They cannot be used separately, nor will they work in any other system. So today, for example, we're going to talk about the digital age skill sets. And while we do teach a few of these skill sets in our present K-12 schools, they are not taught in any great depth, and it's very difficult for teachers to teach them properly in our present K-12 schools.
And one of the reasons for that is because high school subjects, for example, are taught very isolated. So in our first episode, we discussed the standards educational reform movement, and we described the NCLB federal mandate and the follow-on Common Core state standards educational reform program. And we noted that when we talked with a wide range of employers in different career fields, we discovered that the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors that they required and expected for their employees and managers have been largely omitted from the present K-12 school curriculums and courses of study. And most of what are commonly referred to as adult life skill sets are also missing. In fact, 85% of the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors required for the success of our K-12 students in their future adult lives and careers are simply not being taught anywhere in our K-12 schools. Turn it over to Ike at this point.
Yeah, so, we took a look and we talked to a lot of employers in a wide range of careers and jobs. We also talked with folks who have identified what we call adult life skills. And then we created a list of those knowledge sets, skill sets, attitudes, and behaviors with brief descriptions of each one. And then we called that list our digital age skill sets. And today we're going to have a conversation about those digital age skill sets and why it is absolutely critical for our K-12 students to learn them, apply and practice them, and ultimately to master them. So, Brian, would you please give our audiences some examples of these digital age skill sets?
So our current list includes 50 items. Let's start by looking at just 5 from our current list. And here are some charts that picture them as they are listed and described in our book. Personal financial management. This is about how to manage one's personal finances, including money management, savings, investments, taxes, budgeting, etc. Practical living skills. This is how to do the simple, useful, practical things in everyday life, such as how to drive a car or any vehicle safely, effectively, and efficiently, how to change a tire on your car, how to use a washing machine and dryer, how to do basic cooking and food preparation, how to plant and successfully grow and harvest a vegetable garden, flower garden, shrubs, fruit trees, landscaping shrubs, bushes with drip watering systems, etc., how to do exterior and interior painting, how to use common tools, hammers, saws, wrenches, pliers, wire cutters, screwdrivers, electrical tools safely and correctly, how to do simple electrical connections, and how to change light bulbs, how to do simple plumbing, how to clean floors, carpets, walls, toilets, showers, bathtubs, kitchen sinks, stovetops, how to do basic sewing, how to find and establish a relationship with a doctor, a dentist, an eye doctor, how to make medical appointments, how to use a pharmacy, how to assess, evaluate, and purchase health insurance, life insurance, homeowners insurance, renters insurance, auto insurance. And if there's one thing that we can all conclude that has surfaced in this current pandemic, is the need for American people to learn these basic skills. Public speaking. This is about how to speak and deliver presentations to any size audience in professional, polished, and sophisticated ways. It's also about understanding and using sophisticated questioning and response techniques to effectively engage a wide range of audiences. It is also about understanding the power of silence. Customer supplier service. This involves how to deliver excellent service to a wide range of customers with different individual needs, requirements, and demands, and how to work effectively with a wide range of suppliers to get them to deliver what the business enterprise and or specific individuals require for successful creation and delivery of products and or services. And finally, listening skills, how to use active, passive, critical, empathetic, reductive, and expansive listening skills in the proper ways as needed in various listening contexts and situations, and also understanding the difference between not listening as a consensus, purposeful choice, and distracted listening, and not listening as the result of stress-induced auditory dysfunction is what this is all about. And I would add to that how many times have all of us watched news programs, and it seems that the game is all about who can yell or argue the loudest, and everyone is talking over everyone else. So this is a major issue that we need to look at as a culture. In our digital age learning systems, our model of K-12 education, every high school graduate would learn, apply, practice, and master these kinds of skill sets. But here is the critical question. Which of these digital age skill sets are the most critical and the most important for K-12 students to learn, to apply, to practice, and to master?
Thank you, Brian. Well, in our book, our foundation book, we identified the most important skill set as lifelong learning. And we prepared a just a small chart here that you can take a look at that defines this critical skill set. And lifelong learning is a process that every single human being on this planet needs to learn. It is a fundamental process. It is also a set of practices, and it's an art form. And it's really all about continual learning, knowing how to learn. It's also a fundamental requirement for adult life and for about 99% of all jobs and careers in the digital age. As you know, we are living in a time of super rapid technological change. So whatever job you may hold, you're going to have to learn all the time. It's also a process of continually seeking out new knowledge, new skills, new attitudes, and new behaviors. In other words, lifelong learning is not passive. A lot of the learning that goes on right now in our current K-12 schools is passive learning. The students just sit there, the teacher teaches, the teacher gives a lecture, the teacher discusses things. The students don't do too much. They listen, they take notes, but their learning is kind of passive. Lifelong learning is active. It means that you've got to reach out. You've got to constantly seek new information. And lifelong learning is a process of continually exploring, investigating, questioning, challenging assumptions, analyzing, assessing, and evaluating. One of the challenges we face in our is, a lot of information flowing at us in huge amounts and very quickly. So how do we know what's valid, what's accurate? We have to assess that. We have to evaluate that. And that leads me to a question for Brian. Why is lifelong learning such a critical and very important skill set?
In my teaching experience, looking back on my career, now being retired, districts liked to use the term lifelong learning, but it was a term used. It was never a term that was analyzed and discussed.
A nice thought.
As an example, a younger teacher and I went into a classroom, and we were sitting in there observing, and when we came out about half an hour later, I asked the other teacher, I said, okay, describe what you just saw in one word. And this young teacher kind of wasn't really quite sure where I was going. And I said, okay, what I just observed for half an hour was compliance. The teacher is talking. The teacher is going through PowerPoint slides. All of the class, all the students are dead quiet, heads down, pencils moving 50 miles an hour. And that was what was going on. Yep. Okay. So right now we all live in a digital age. And one of the hard realities of life is change. But with the huge advances in technology that have happened over the past 25 years, we are now experiencing huge waves of very rapid change. Can anyone imagine living without a mobile smartphone or living without the internet and social media? Actually, I could handle doing without social media, but anyway.
No, you couldn't.
Probably not.
No, you couldn't.
We live in a day where cars today are more like computers. So one of the things that our students must be able to do is to deal with these constant rapid changes. And that requires all students to know how to learn new information, new knowledge, new skills, new attitudes, and new behaviors very quickly, and to apply and use these skill sets effectively and at high levels of performance quality. In other words, our students must be able to do the process of lifelong learning continuously, and they must be able to do it at very high levels of quality. And this is true for 99% of the jobs and careers for adult life. So I guess one other point, schools always have, districts have mission statements.
Oh, I love those.
And one of the favorite terms that you always see is career ready.
Yep.
And if you were to take your first day of school and interview your students on what they understand about careers, you'd quickly discover that other than their parents, they know very little about what is out there in the job market. So, yeah, I mean, that's just a fact. Lifelong learning is a convenient term used by districts, but the application of what that means and how it plays out in the adult world, that just kind of gets like the standards. We cover them.
Well, and if you really look at what's going on in K-12, the focus is academic.
Yeah.
Okay. In other words, the kids are learning English, math, science, social studies. In the elementary grades, they're learning reading and arithmetic and a little bit of science. But it's all academic. It's not connected directly to anything in the real world. And so, yes, they do learn some of those things. And reading, for example, is one of our digital age skill sets. You've got to be a very good reader. But where we go with reading is you have to take it further. You have to do technical reading, which is very different than the reading you do in school. And kids, they learn this stuff, they take the standardized test, and then they promptly forget it. Okay, that is not lifelong learning. Lifelong learning is learning a skill set like public speaking, for example. In order to be a good public speaker, you've got to learn it and you've got to practice it all the time.
Right.
Not something you just take a course or take a test and then you move on. No, you have to practice, practice, practice. And in our last episode, we talked, for example, about letter grades. And we noted that letter grades simply do not mean much to employers. Employers don't care about letter grades. What they care about when they go to hire people is what have you done? What are your performances? What skill sets do you have? And they are looking for lifelong learning at a very high level of quality because business owners know that the marketplace changes in the twinkling of an eye. And so their employees have to learn all the time and do it very well if they're going to keep up with the customers and the suppliers. So if we don't use letter grades because they don't work with lifelong learning, the next question we need to raise is, how do we measure high levels of quality in lifelong learning?
One example that I kind of crack up when I think about how leadership districts, leaders in districts attempted to address the issue of lifelong learning, I'm reminded of a commercial where this guy gets up, walks to the front of the plane, sits down behind the pilot's seat, and the plane's about ready to go down, and everyone's looking at this guy like, are you a pilot? And he turns around and he says, don't worry, I've played the acting role of a pilot before. And
there you go.
It's when I used to have these conversations with lots of different people, I felt like I was living in a bubble because everyone only sees what's lifelong learning is a term to write up on the board or put it on a poster in front of your class.
Yep.
And that somehow sufficed as to
that'll take care of it.
Yeah,
right?
That takes care of it. But the key thing with lifelong learning that matters in terms of digital age skill sets is the term performance.
That's right.
So actually doing lifelong learning and doing it at very high levels of quality that are required by employers and in the adult world. Let's take an example and focus on the process of learning and applying some new knowledge and information about how to deliver a new product. Let's say roofing tiles with built-in solar panels to the customers of a solar electric company, namely house building construction contractors. The employees will need to know all of the detailed information about these new roofing tiles with solar panels, how they are manufactured, transported, and properly installed? And will they also need to know detailed information about the home building process? Let me restate that. And they will also need to know detailed information about the home building process so that they can explain to the building contractors how and why these new roofing tiles with solar panels are easy to install with the proper trusses and plywood roof sheeting that will support the weight of room tiles with solar panels. So that's an example.
Yeah, my dad was a building contractor, and there were new products coming out all the time. And when he talked with the people, the suppliers, that's exactly what they had to do. They had to tell him, inform him, hey, we've got this new product, whatever it is, a new roofing tile or, whatever. And he always had lots of questions, of course. And if you're really good at what you do, you've got to be ready to answer those questions. That's critical. That's called delivering really high quality customer service. And the change here is, instead of what we talked about before with letter grades, when you focus on performance, you have to then create some quality performance scales.
Right.
So we would say, okay, this is what a top quality customer service performance look like. And this is what a good one looks like. And this is what kind of an average or fair one looks like. And this is what a not so good or unsatisfactory performance looks like. And so when managers, business owners are training their employees or evaluating their employees, that's what they do. They use scales. They look at performance scales and they know, hey, this is what really high level customer service looks like, folks. This is what I'm looking for. This is what I expect from my employees. And they also know when it's not right. And so they are constantly seeking feedback from their customers and their suppliers. Okay, when you met with one of my people and you were thinking about buying these new roofing tiles with solar panels, did they do a really good job of explaining to you how you could use those? The business owner wants to know that.
Right.
And he wants to be sure his employees know how to deliver that and do it really, really well, because that's what makes the sale.
I remember in my guitar program, especially with my intermediate and advanced classes, I would actually demonstrate technically what is a rubric regarding performance.
Yeah.
And it got rather comical with a lot of kids because I would demonstrate a bad performance.
Right.
And we would talk about it in class.
Yeah. And the other thing you were doing there in terms of the teaching learning process, the other thing you were doing, which is very important, is when you involve the students in co-creating that rubric.
Yes.
Okay, folks, we're going to play Hotel California. Show me what a really ace top quality performance looks like. Okay, now show me one that's just kind of, okay. And then show me one that just stinks. Okay, everyone can see those quality differences. Yep. Okay, and they buy in because they have helped you, the teacher, co-create that. They know exactly what they have to do. So
the other thing that it's interesting, you mentioned that particular song because I met with another teacher at another school, and his attitude was, well, this is the key that it's in. This is how I teach it. And I remember saying, okay, look, I love the Eagles, but not all of us have ultra high voices.
Right.
So for all of the guys in my class and ladies, I would teach the song in 3 different keys, dependent upon, who the person was, because singing was very important. You can't just sit there and strum the chords without something else going on. All the different parts of that song, there's a whole, it's a whole menu. It's almost like a mini symphony of sorts. And I would go through all of that with kids, and key changes were very important. Professional people do that all the time, depend upon the circumstances. A lot of older musicians today that had,
Right.
you go back and you watch them, 30 years later, what are they doing with a lot of their songs? They're lowering the keys so they can still vocally deliver, what's going on.
Well, and they're going to deliver it in a good quality way
Yes, they are.
rather than trying to strain to get a
Yeah.
high note that they can't do anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
They can't do that. So the question here is, and I'm sure some of our audience members may have this question. So in school right now, the kids learn reading, they learn math, they learn science, etc. What happens to those things in the digital age skill sets?
Another important thing here, we need to understand that the employees will also be learning, applying, and practicing technical reading skills, mathematics skills, public speaking skills, and listening skills because of all of these skill sets. They are required in order to deliver top quality customer support explanations.
Right. And I think the other reality we really want to emphasize here is practice. As you know from teaching your guitar courses, that when those students had to do their annual guitar show, that was a product of thousands of hours of practice.
Right.
And they understood that. And they understood, and this is very important, in the professional music industry, okay, all the people we see as quote unquote stars, they didn't just get there magically. They spent a ton of time practice, practice, practice. And the problem we have right now in our present K-12 schools, time is simply not there. There's not enough time for the practice. And so let's go back to public speaking as our example. We really need to start with the kids when they're in kindergarten. And each year you practice public speaking, it gets a little more in depth, it gets a little more appropriate for your age level, but it's not a course and it's not one event. Okay. It's constant, continuous practice. So by the time you get to be a senior in high school, you are comfortable giving, let's say, a 20 or 30-minute public speech to a fairly large audience. Okay. That's the key. You've got to have practice, 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 and it has to be repeated in spirals as you get older. Okay. But we don't do that in the present public schools. We simply don't do that, other than in courses like the one you were teaching, where your kids took beginning guitar, intermediate guitar, advanced guitar, and each time they had to practice, practice, practice over and over and over again.
By the time they got to a stage show, performance, public event, as I always used to tell them, that's where you basically turn in your homework.
Right.
You don't learn. I mean, you learn things on stage, but you better not be learning arrangements, trying to learn them on the fly while you're performing.
Right.
So they're learning about PA systems, monitors, how to wire everything up, professional lighting, how to properly dress on stage so that you don't just look like another student walking down the hallways of the high school, how to do publicity before the event, how to design a program that looks professional, that people can pick up as they come in. And of course, the other thing that was very important is that a lot of these young folks, public speaking was clearly a big part of what they were doing in the show. Right. My job was not to get up there on stage and try to micromanage the whole thing. In fact, my role, as I told them repeatedly, I will be in the back. I will sit back and watch. I might make a few little adjustments on the soundboard, but everything happening with you folks, that's the show. If I'm up there trying to run around and be a cheerleader, it just doesn't, that's not realistic.
Right.
Yeah.
But it raises an important question. And that question is, if we're talking about lifelong learning,
right,
and we're talking about the regular academic courses, not your music program, how then would our students be able to do or practice something like customer support or public speaking or listening skills? How would they do that in the present K-12 public schools.
You cannot, and given all of the nonstop interruptions that I noticed right at the end of my career, it's wow. In my guitar courses, my students learned and understood that professional musicians put in thousands of hours of practice and that they needed to practice daily to get to very high levels of mastery performance. When I taught economics to seniors, a lot of times, well, I would always say, take the textbook home, leave it on your desk. Don't worry about covering the book. I've got a class set. If we need to use it, I'll be the first one to let you know. And a lot of stuff that I covered was really not, it was glossed over in the textbook, but never in detail. One of my assignments was, I called it the American Dream. Students would actually research the local housing market. They would get a flyer of a piece of property somewhere in their community. They would do all the mathematics of what the monthly payment would be if you had a loan for 30 years. And of course, back then it was ironic to think about this in today's context, but why you should probably grab onto a fixed loan as opposed to a variable loan.
Right.
And I think 2008, people finally understood that. But I went through a lot of stuff that was just dealing with day-to-day life, having kids go to a grocery store and look at the ingredients and all of the products that were being bought, how to shop in a more effective way, going around the outside of the grocery store and trying to avoid the center. A lot of this stuff of how to be an effective consumer so that you don't make all these common mistakes. I taught about credit cards, the danger of credit cards, the danger of college loans.
Right.
And, the minute you talk about these things with kids in an adult world context, wow, suddenly they get involved. Suddenly this is important because they see how it applies to their daily life, which is the biggest problem today with most high school students. The current curriculums that they deal with, the Common Core, I used to call the Common Bore. That's what it did. It bored the heck out of everybody.
Right.
So,
well, and the other thing that you mentioned there, and this sometimes is very difficult to see, very difficult to perceive, okay, is that we tell the kids, okay, you've got to take all these college prep courses. You've got to take sciences. You've got to take advanced levels of math and calculus and all this stuff to get into a college or a university. But what we don't tell them, that's critical. And the students and the parents, they are not getting any information that's significant or up to date on specific careers, what those careers require, what kind of training is required, what kind of performances you have to deliver. So the students leave K-12 and they simply don't know. Okay. So, I have talked to students, you have talked to students who are now doing other things, which they had to figure out all on their own after high school. And it was a very rocky, tough experience. But, it's like, okay, what if I want to be a plumber? Well, what if I want to be a stonemason? What if I want to be a luthier? Where do I find that information? Well, the typical answer in high schools from the counselors is, well, go to the career center.
right.
Which is a nice romantic thought. But what you did in your guitar courses, which is critical, is you brought in guest speakers and guest performers, people from the industry.
Right.
Who talked with the kids and said, okay, if you would like to be a performer or any other part of the industry, you want to work in a studio or you want to do the business side or whatever, here are the requirements. Okay. Yeah. And the kids were paying attention because here's somebody who's doing it, somebody
Right.
from the industry, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's right now in the present system, that's simply not there. The kids are not getting, and the parents too, they're not getting the information they need so that they can make good decisions. And as we said before, colleges, university, very expensive, and there are no guarantees. You can have a nice bachelor's degree, you can take out $100,000 in loans, and guess what kind of a job that gets you? Nothing. Doesn't guarantee anything.
I used to tell kids, how much does a welder make?
Yeah.
And after I went through that, I said, okay, how much would you make if you could do it underwater? I mean,
Exactly right.
These are subjects that I think, need to be discussed with high school students. It doesn't have to be all construction trades. It has to be all kinds of professions that just kids aren't aware of because they don't get talked about in the typical high school curriculum.
Right. And it's important because in the present system, we have this huge sort of context of college prep. And then on top of that, we layer in all of these hundreds and hundreds of academic standards and this big emphasis on standardized testing. And again, going back to what you said at the beginning of this program, they talk about lifelong learning, they talk about career preparation, but the reality is they don't do it. So the kids finish high school, they have memorized hundreds of standards, they've taken the standardized test 3 times, and they leave high school, and it's like, okay, what happens now? Well, the answer is they struggle because they don't have the skill sets and they don't have the information they need about whatever career might be of interest to them.
And all of these things intersect. If you say to kids, one of your main issues that you will be coming into in the adult world is obviously climate change. And when you talk about the new administration, especially in the months ahead, the major issue they will probably focus on is infrastructure.
There you go.
When you look at that, you're talking about a huge, just a menu of skill sets that would be required to actually get in there and fix all of these things going on in the country. You talk about a fire that happens in Northern California that devastates a small town, and you find out that the company that was responsible for that was dealing with equipment that was almost 100 years old.
Right.
Infrastructure is a major issue.
Right.
The short and very sad answer here is that in our present K-12 schools, the students simply cannot do this. Our present K-12 schools have a curriculum that is divided into academic subject areas: math, English, language arts, science, and history, social studies, or what we call MESH. And in middle schools and high schools, the students learn by completing courses in these academic subject areas. But all of these subjects are very isolated. They almost function independent of each other just in terms of the way that they're taught. And while the students might be able to get to some aspects of lifelong learning in certain vocational courses or visual and performing arts courses, there are simply not a lot of direct connections to the real adult world and to the quality performance expectations of 99% of all jobs and careers. Also, in our present K-12 school systems, there is no time for the level of repeated practice that is required because our school days are only 6.5 hours and our annual school calendars have only 180 days of instruction. And we need to remember that we lose about 2 to 3 weeks of learning each year because of standardized testing and other activities like food drives, sports rallies, homecoming, etc. And our teachers have lots of daily interruptions where teaching and learning time and practice time is lost. And that is a definite. It's almost like the subjects, as we said in our book, they're compartmentalized.
Right.
Right.
And I think it's tough for the students because they're told that this is the college prep curriculum. Okay.
Yeah.
They're told that you got to take these courses. And in the last few years, there's been a big push for kids to go into advanced placement courses, which are supposed to be like a college course. But they're never told, how does all this fit together? It's up to them to figure that out, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, they don't see those connections. And then when they look outside, many of the kids, for example, that were in your guitar program, because of what you did and because you brought in people from the industry, they knew what was expected of them if they chose that as a career. Okay.
Right.
But they were struggling because it's like, okay, what does that have to do with third period English? I don't know. What does it have to do with fourth period biology? I don't know. They're never told what those connections are. Now, the connections are there. Okay. And one of the great examples I always remember, our good friend who was a teacher at the local continuation school, she struggled for many years to teach those kids biology.
Yeah.
And these were students who had been in the regular high school, who had failed a bunch of courses, who had all kinds of personal issues. Excuse me. So they would transfer to a continuation program. And she would work with them and try to teach them biology. And she said it was just a struggle because a lot of them were poor readers. They had a lot of experience in school that was not good. Their attitudes were not good. They were just sort of, I'm just kind of going through the motions here. And they were way behind on credits toward graduation. So one year she just decided this is not working.
Right.
This is not working. So what she did was, behind the school, there was a local creek. And she decided, you know what? I'm going to take my class down there and I'm going to teach them they're going to actually learn by doing. Okay. And so she went down there and she showed them, these are the native plants that grow here naturally. And all of these other plants were brought in by outsiders, and they're essentially a bunch of weeds, and we need to clean this up. So they cleaned up the stream bed area. Then she got them engaged in looking at water quality. Mm-hmm. And she had some friends at UC Davis, and they came in and they showed the kids how to collect the water samples, how to analyze those water samples. And what they discovered is the water in that creek was highly polluted, had a lot of bad chemicals in there. And so she said, well, you can't just test in one place. So they went upstream. About every 100 feet, they would take water samples, and they kept working upstream for about a quarter of a mile. And all the time they were getting bad quality. And all of a sudden, they reached a certain spot and they kept going upstream, but the water quality suddenly improved. So she told them, now, what does that tell you? And they figured out that something right at that spot was polluting the water.
Right.
So they started looking around, and again, they were cleaning everything up. So they're removing brush and weeds and all this stuff. And there's this drain pipe sticking out of the side of the hill. And this stuff is coming out of the drain pipe, and they took a sample of that, and it was nasty.
Yeah.
And so
yeah,
she said, okay, I wonder where this pipe comes from. So she gave them another project, and they had to try and figure that out. And they had to contact people from the city. They had to contact people. There was a nearby set of railroad tracks. She contacted people from the railroad, and they researched, and they had a hard time because this pipe apparently had been there for decades, and people had forgotten about it. They didn't even know it was there. She took the water samples and she gave copies of the analysis to the city. She gave copies of the analysis to the railroad and said, there's some bad chemicals coming out of this pipe. They checked it out. They finally discovered that pipe went clear back under the highway, back under the railroad tracks to where there used to be an old oil sump. And that's what was draining into the creek, And after those kids did that, she said, I got them.
Right.
I got them. They could understand what they were talking about in the biology class because they had discovered what was going on in the real world. And that is with the digital age skill sets, that is the key. Okay. The whole key is in our model, you start with the real world. That's always the right context. Okay. Now, will you need math? Of course. Will you need science? Of course. But you learn those things in a real world context, not as just some disconnected academic thing, whatever it might be. So
yeah,
I think that, this is a very serious problem. It's a very serious problem. And the kids, going back to the title of our book, listening to our students. Every time you and I talk to those kids, and you talk to them, for example, in your economics classes and in your guitar classes, and you said, okay, talk to me about what's happening here. They told you, and they told us when we met with them, but you and I are in the distinct minority. Very few people are listening to those students. No one's paying any attention to what they're saying. And as you said, hey, kids, how do you feel about these standards? Oh, boring.
They don't deal with what districts don't deal with a feedback loop of actually listening to what kids have to say. I guess I'll mention some names here, but for example, and this was years ago, I had Robin Ford as a guest speaker, and he also performed. And it wasn't just show and tell, it's explaining to kids, you're going to go online and you're going to look up this gentleman and get a better understanding as to why he is one of the most outstanding jazz blues guitar players on the planet. He's been on tour with Miles Davis. He played with George Harrison and toured with one of the guys in the Beatles. You need to learn about, where he's gone and so what he's done worldwide, and you're in a better position to ask him questions. I don't want you sitting there saying, gee, Mr. Ford, what kind of guitar picks should I use? No. I want you asking some really in-depth, and I reviewed those questions. It was an assignment they had to hand in.
Right.
So we get through that. And then there was follow-up. After Mr. Ford left, it's like, okay, you're going to send him a thank you letter. You're going to,
right,
do some on. I had Jerry Martini from Sly and the Family Stone. And the kids discovered, oh my gosh, this is a famous band that he started decades ago. One of the first bands in America that was multicultural. And suddenly that opened up a whole wide discussion about musical styles, trends, the history of America, the history of blues, for example.
Yep.
I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that so many subjects that we teach compartmentalized and isolated in high school, they used to call it writing across the curriculum, like that was some big new. It's like, no, this is just standardized adult world reality that all of these things intersect, and kids need to learn those intersections. You can't teach them isolated.
Right. And I think as we're approaching the end of our episode here, the big shift in our model is simply this. In the present system, you have all these courses that are compartmentalized and disconnected from each other and from the real world.
Right.
Okay? But in our model, the next component that we're going to talk about in our next episode, actually two more components, we shift to what we call project-based learning. Okay, so in your guitar program, for example, the kids knew that every spring they had to put on an annual guitar show. All right, that is, we'll call that the product, if you will.
Right.
But they were working on that project throughout the entire fall, and actually from the previous years that they were working in your courses, and they knew all of the things that had to be done.
And it was more than just one show. A lot of times it was
Right.
performing several nights,
Right.
which is what professional people have to deal with.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right. And so one of the things in our model that we shift to is what we call project-based learning. The kids are engaged in real, meaningful, challenging projects individually and in small teams. Okay. And they address challenging, relevant, interesting programs and questions and issues. How do we fix the infrastructure in your neighborhood or in your community?
Right.
That's a hard problem. Okay. And the adults are struggling with that problem. Okay. And so that, I think, is the big shift, because when you work on projects like a guitar show, okay, all of those other skill sets come in, but they're in a real and connected context. Excuse me.
Right.
And it's all connected for them, and they see it right away. It's like, hey, you got to run the soundboard. You got to do the lighting. You got to prepare the handouts for the parents and the public. You've got to set up the microphones and the amps, and you got to do all this stuff. Okay. And underneath that, do you have to do technical reading? Oh, you bet you do. Do you have to do some arithmetic and mathematics? Oh, yes, you do.
Yeah.
And if the sound system is not set up correctly, you will rapidly learn the realities of science.
Well, a friend of mine had a program, I think it was called Math and Construction, but in short, it was bringing in young people, high school students, building a home. And
bingo.
My gosh, I mean, roofing, sheetrock, painting, the foundation, putting in kitchen cabinets, plumbing, electrical. Oh my gosh. And did they use math? So much math that by the time they got to the end of the class, it fulfilled their math requirement, which he had to do all of that in order to get the program to qualify. But he had to jump through all of these hoops to make that happen.
Right.
But, oh my gosh, the kids, the waiting list to get into his class, parents showing up on weekends with kids working to get a project, get this aspect of the project done because we've got inspectors coming this next week. The learning curve was just astounding, that came up in that program.
Yeah. Well, and to conclude here, what that also brings up is the other thing we're going to talk about next time, and that's called applied systems thinking.
Right.
Because what those kids were doing was the construction process, the whole process. So they had to understand the proper sequencing of things, how everything fit together. And what they were really looking at is a home. And what a home is a system.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they had to understand how all of that worked together, and it's just a totally different kind of learning than sitting in your English class and trying to figure out how does what I'm doing in here connect to the real world.
Or being in a wood shop class where, oh, look at us, we made some bookends,
Yeah. Like, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
But anyway, next time we're going to talk about project-based learning in a little more depth. And we're also going to talk about applied systems thinking, which is one of our digital age skill sets that 99% of the people simply don't know anything about that.
Right.
Okay. I think we are I think we're good.
We're at the end here. Well, thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Until next time.
Yes. We'll look for you next time. Bye-bye.
I got a dozen roses for the girl upstairs.